glad you're here today to worship with us. And I want to tell you a story. Some of you may have heard me tell this story a long time ago, but it's not one of my finer moments, okay? I'll just go ahead and preface it that way. I call this story the Pee Wee Herman story. All right, you remember Pee Wee Herman? Ha! The stars at night. Okay. If you remember Pee Wee Herman from back in the day. So anyway, the Pee Wee Herman story is like this. Back when I was about 16 years old, and I was in our youth ministry. We were on a youth group trip. We had gone to St. Petersburg, Florida, and that was where our youth minister was from, and that was his wife's home church actually. And so we were there, and we had gone on this trip, and so what we were doing is the youth group was being broken up at night. During the day we were doing what we had come there to do, but during the night we'd break up, and so there was her home church there in St. Pete, First Christian Church of St. Petersburg, Florida, would then break us up into groups, and we would go home and stay with families that were part of that church. And so one evening we are there at the church in the parking lot. Now this is in downtown St. Pete. This is where this church is. So, and from what I heard at the time, it wasn't the greatest neighborhood. But we were sitting there, and we had a 15-passenger church van, and there was a playground, and we're in the parking lot, and so some of the kids are playing over on the playground. I'm in the church van, and this is important that you kind of get a picture of this. So you got the front two seats, right? You got the driver's seat, the passenger seat, and then you got the benches behind that, right? Bench 1, bench 2, 3, however many there were. I was sitting on the first bench. Okay, there was no one in the driver's seat or the passenger seat here. They were empty. I'm on the first bench. Now, next to me on my left is my girlfriend at the time. And next to me on my right was another girl in our youth group. We were good friends, but they're sitting on either side of us, right? And then all the way in the very back was another girl in our youth group. All the rest of the kids were either just standing in the parking lot talking, playing, or on the playground or whatever. We're just waiting on our opportunity to get picked up by our families. Well, about that time, we started noticing a bunch of police sirens and emergency vehicles flying all over the place. And sirens going loud, cars racing all over the place, and it was very chaotic. And so it got our attention, and we're all kind of paying attention. Well, about that moment, I notice, coming down an alley across the street, running right towards us is this guy. And looks all strung out and sweaty, and he's running from something, obviously. And this is where he looked like the picture of Paul Rubens back in 1990 when he got arrested. And I don't know if you remember that, when Pee Wee Herman got arrested, okay? But that was the picture he looked. So this became forever the Pee Wee Herman story after that. So this guy's running down this aisle, and he's running right at our van. And I can see out the front windshield, I'm watching this guy run at us, police cars going everywhere. And he comes up to the side door of our van that was open, and he dives head first into the van, into the little aisle that you would use to get down to the back seat. So what do you think I did? This is where it gets fun. Okay. Remember, I've got my girlfriend, another girl, and another girl in there. That's all there in the van, and the rest, everybody's out playing. So my first instinct is I throw my hands out on them two, and I propel myself forward through the front two seats and out the driver's door. And I take off running. I don't stop until I get to the playground, and I'm hiding at that point. And then that's when all of a sudden a little voice in my head says, "But wait, what about your girlfriend? What about the other two girls in the van?" Well, I turn around and I look, and they had all made their way out and were running as well. And so they were safe. But I would say that in that moment, my relationship was over. It took a little while for that to become obvious, but that was kind of the way it played out. In our youth group, forever came to know what ended up happening was our youth minister went over and talked to the guy and got him to get out of the van. And as soon as he got out, all the rest of us pile into the van, and we shut and locked the doors, and we locked our youth minister out as well. And the guy proceeds, and he was obviously having some issues, proceeds to, I think he sang the national anthem while jumping up and down on the bumper of our van, while we're a bunch of teenagers freaking out in the van, right? You can imagine how scary that was for us. The police eventually get there. Yes, it was him that they were looking for, and they arrest him. And that's the end of the story. But again, not my proudest moment. You see, sometimes we make decisions in the moment that we regret. And I think you've probably experienced that before. We're going through this series, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. In week 1, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself, or am I lying to myself? Am I telling myself what I need to hear? We talked about confirmation bias. How a lot of times we'll take the information in that we want to hear. We'll take in the things that we want to hear. But anybody that disagrees with us, anybody that doesn't tell us what we want to hear, we'll ignore that information, and we'll make our decision based only on what we want to hear. Now, week 2, we talked about the legacy question. Not just am I lying to myself or am I being honest with myself, but what kind of story do I want to write? When I'm making big decisions in my life, what kind of story do I want to write? What do I want to say? We talked about focalism. And last week is when we talked about it. We talked about focalism and what it means to kind of be focused on this, what we want, on our desire, and ignore some of the dangers and the pitfalls that are lying right there next to us in the dark. Maybe we just kind of blind it. It's tunnel vision. And so we're guilty of that sometimes. And so 2 questions that we've challenged you to ask so far when making big decisions in your life. Ask yourself the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself? Ask yourself the legacy question. What story do I want to tell? And today, we're going to talk about another question, a third question. It's the conscience question. And it's an important one. And one of the pressures, when we talked about confirmation bias, we've talked about focalism, and today one of the struggles in asking the conscience question is this. It's called time pressure. We put this pressure sometimes on ourselves when we have a decision that we're facing. I've got to make a decision. I've got to make it now. I've got to make it fast, or I'm going to miss an opportunity. But sometimes that pressure gets put on us by someone else. You've got to make this decision. I can't wait on you forever. We need to know right now. And here's the thing. We talk about and wrestling with all these decisions, but I want you to think about this statement. Go ahead and throw that up there, Josh. The first statement is sometimes good decision making is more than assessing the facts before us. Sometimes good decision making is more than just taking the facts that lie there, the obvious things that sit there right in front of us. That night in Florida, didn't take me but a split second to assess what was going on and decide what I was going to do. Unfortunately, I had all the information that I was willing to consider in that moment. What else was I supposed to do, right? And granted, it's hard to second guess a fight or flight response in a situation like that. But I got to ask you this. I got to ask you a little bit more serious question. Have you ever been faced with a decision where all the facts seem to point to an obvious choice, yet you still felt uneasy about it? Yet something just felt off. Have you ever faced that before? An example might be maybe you're in a relationship with someone. You're dating, or maybe if you're a parent and your teenage child's dating someone. And everything seems great. They're polite. They say all the right things. They look nice. They seem happy together, but something is nagging at you. Something's just not right. Have you ever felt that way before? You've had that feeling, that nagging voice in the back of your head. Maybe it's not about dating someone. Maybe it's a new job that you're considering. Maybe it's a major purchase that you're about to make. Maybe it's an email or a text that you're about to send where all the facts say, do it, nothing's wrong with this, it's going to be fine. Yet there's that nagging voice in your head says, hang on just a minute. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul, he says these words, and I think this contributes to what we're talking about here. He says this in verses 18 and 19. Paul says, do not deceive yourselves. If any of you think you are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And here's what I hear Paul saying in that. This is the Apostle Paul's way of telling us that even when we've assembled all the facts that we can and they point to a certain choice, sometimes the voice in your head isn't just self-doubt. It isn't just a lack of self-confidence. Sometimes that voice is God trying to get your attention so that he can show you that your wisdom can't always see and know the whole story. You think you have all the facts of your lower story. And we all have a lower story. You've heard me talk about this. The story that where we walk around, where we live every day, the things around us, the things we can touch, the things we know. That's our lower story. I operate in my lower story. But God has an upper story that's much bigger than that. His story, his plan, and it connects all of our stories together. It connects all of our stories together with the people from the Bible. It connects all of our stories through all of time. This is God's upper story, and we're a part of that. And what I want us to think about is this. Sometimes God intervenes. Sometimes God speaks up into our lower story and says, you think you see everything, but you just don't. We call it, a lot of times, our conscience, don't we? We call that our conscience. Let me ask you a question. What do you do when your conscience speaks up? What do you do when you think you're making a good decision or you think you've got the answers, and all of a sudden your conscience stops you, causes you to hesitate? What do? Now, I want to be clear about one thing before we move any further in this. I believe God gave every single one of us in here a brain. And I think he gave us the ability to reason and make good decisions on our own. He gave us the ability to assess the facts assembled before us and to make good choices based on those facts in many situations. And I'm in no way, through this message today, trying to imply that we should cast aside the facts for every little gut feeling that we feel. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is this, is that when we are making at least moderately important decisions, and suddenly that little voice speaks up, maybe we should pause for a moment to see if it really might be God trying to show us something. It's the conscience question that I want to ask you today. You see, Isaiah, an Old Testament prophet, and we see his book and we quote from it often, but Isaiah was a prophet for the nation of Israel, and he had access to kings, the kings of Israel at the time. And at this time in history when Isaiah was speaking, about 700 years before Jesus came on the scene, Israel had been disobedient to God, and God was in the process of punishing them. He was using the Assyrian Empire. He was on the verge of having the Assyrian Empire come in and take over and to suppress Israel as punishment. And they were going to be feeling that, and Isaiah knew it, and he knew why. And Isaiah was speaking to them. He was speaking on one hand saying, you are being punished, and this is why, but I want you to have hope. I want you to know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's something on the other side. I'm still your God. I'm still there with you. And I want you to look at what Isaiah says in chapter 30, verses 19 to 21. It says, people of Zion who live in Jerusalem, you will weep no more. How gracious he will be when you cry for help. As soon as he hears, he will answer you. Although the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, your teachers will be hidden no more. With your own eyes, you will see them. And I love this line right here. I've underlined it. Whether you turn to the left or to the right, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way. Walk in it. And I love the picture that this text paints for us. God promises us that his voice will be there to guide his people. They will constantly face decisions where they will be tempted, they will be drawn to turn to the right or to the left. But his voice will constantly be there to keep them on the path if they will just pause long enough to hear it. The Bible tells us that God's people still have that voice with them today. Guys, if we are followers of Christ, if we are children of God, we are promised that we still have that voice today. And so today, that's why I want to ask you the conscience question. And here it is, and if you're following along in your outline today, fill that out. The question is this: is there attention that deserves your attention? Is there attention that deserves your attention? And I want to use an Old Testament story to kind of illustrate this, where someone seemed to have all the facts exactly the way they need them to make a good decision, but there was a tension. And they had a decision to make, whether they were going to stop and listen to that and explore it, or whether they were going to keep going. What happens in this story? This is a story about David before he became king of Israel. At this time, the very first king of Israel was King Saul. Saul is the king, but Saul had displeased God. So God had decided that he was going to anoint a new king, but he wasn't going to anoint one of Saul's sons. It wasn't going to stay in the family. Instead, Saul sent the prophet Samuel to another man's family named Jesse and said, from this family, you're going to anoint the next king. And Samuel went there thinking he was going to find maybe Jesse's oldest son and anoint him king. But God said, no, you're going to take his youngest one, the one that seems the least obvious. His name's David, and you're going to anoint him king. He was still just a boy at the time, shepherding his sheep. And at that point, and the nation of Israel knows this. This isn't some secret. Saul knows this, that this young boy has been anointed as the next king of Israel. Well, as David grows up, we see things happen. We see him do some pretty amazing things as a shepherd boy. We see him, and the story of David and Goliath happens during this time frame. He stands up to Goliath when the rest of the Israelite army was afraid of him. Saul sees David doing these amazing things. David, as he grows up, eventually joins Saul's army. And he's going around and has these amazing conquests, these feats. And all of a sudden, David's this hero that thousands of men around Israel are praising David and all the amazing things, the brave things he does. What an amazing warrior. And Saul is so jealous, he can't see straight. He wants David dead. And he's plotting. It says now, where our story picks up today in 1 Samuel chapter 24, Saul has been off fighting in a war against the Philistines, and he comes home and he finds out, you see, during all this time, because David knew about Saul's growing hatred and desire to kill him, David and a few men, this band of guys that were loyal to David, had gone into hiding. And it says they were out in the desert of En-Gedi. And now this desert is hundreds of miles in all directions of nothing, except for some caves and some places, just these rocky caves, little rocky caves scattered all over the place. And that's where Saul finds out David's been hiding. So Saul puts together this team, this army of 3,000 men, and decides he's going to go end this once and for all. He's going to find David and he's going to kill him. So it says Saul and his army of 3,000 are going out into this desert and about the area where they found out David was, and they're looking for these men. Amongst all this desert, these little caves everywhere. Well, Saul just being a human, has a moment where it says he needed to relieve himself. And so Saul stops the entire caravan, says, I've got to go to the bathroom. And he gets off his, I don't know what he was riding, his camel, and he decides to find this little cave. He sees this little cave over here, and he walks over to it and decides that this is where I'm going to. So he steps into the mouth of the cave just out of sight of all of his men. What he didn't know was that was the very cave where David and his men were hiding all the way back in the back of the cave where he couldn't see. What are the odds? David and his men hiding in the back of this cave. Now Saul has taken out his outer robe, laid it on the ground, and he's doing his thing. And it says David is sitting there with his men in the back of this cave, and they see Saul come in, squatting down. And the men are like, David, this is amazing. God has anointed you king, and now he's delivered the king into your hands. This is your opportunity. This is your divine moment. Take it. Take the knife, go up there and stab him, slit his throat. Do what you've got to do. take on the king, who can step out of the cave and hold his head up in the air and say, I've done it, I'm king now, bow to me. David's sitting there thinking, I can't believe this is playing out this way. And it says David took a knife and he crept up really quietly behind Saul. Now, we don't know why or at what moment things changed for David. But before he got to Saul and to kill him, instead of killing Saul, instead of stabbing him, he leans over to the cloak that had been cast to the side and he cuts a small corner of it off. And then he creeps back to the back of his cave, and his men who, now remember, these guys are in hiding. These men are fearing for their lives. They believe that David is the anointed king, and now they believe that God's delivered the king into David's hands so David could take the place of king of Israel. They believe that their moment to be free from hiding is here. And David comes back and says, I couldn't do it. It's not right. This isn't how God would have intended it. I can't imagine how the conversation went, but I'm thinking it probably went something like this. I was creeping up there, and all of a sudden, this voice was in the back of my head saying, no, this isn't the story you want to write. I want to read to you the rest of the story from 1 Samuel 24, starting in verse 5. Here's what it says. It says, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. David was acknowledging Saul had been anointed as king by God. Even though David was anointed to be next, Saul's still in that position. And with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave, never knowing that they were there, and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and he called to Saul, my lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. Guys, the facts in this story all seem to point to David having a total 100% green light to kill Saul and to take his rightful place as king. But his conscience had something else to say. His conscience was saying, David, do you want to be the guy who murders the king so that you can be king while he was using the bathroom? Or do you want to be the guy who showed mercy when you could have done the most expedient and obvious thing in killing him? You see, in David's lower story, for a moment there, it looked obvious. He should do it. He should kill him. He should take his place. But God was speaking to David from his upper story. You see, a few chapters later in 1 Samuel, there's a small battle again taking place between Saul's army and the Philistines, and a single archer lets an arrow fly. And that arrow finds a gap in Saul's armor and pierces him and kills him, mortally wounds him, and he eventually dies. You see, God wanted to say, David, yes, you could kill him. Yes, you're anointed to be the next king. But if you'll let my story play out, the story that you can't necessarily completely understand, it's going to go so much better. It's such a better story. Isn't that a better story to tell then, well, yeah, I murdered the king while he was using the bathroom. He never knew I was there. Or would you rather tell the story that says, I trusted God, and God took care of things? I had a moment of pause, and I listened, and I showed mercy, and now people can tell a story that said David shows mercy instead of David took up the knife for himself. Which is a better story to tell? And David made that choice. Guys, today I want to give you 3 things related to the conscience question to think about when you're making big decisions in your life, especially when you feel the pressure of time. Right now's the moment. I've got to act now, or this moment's going to leave me. Right now, I'm never going to have this opportunity again if I don't go now. But that voice says, just wait a second. I want to give you 3 things to think about. Is there a tension that deserves your attention? And the first thing I want you to think about is this. Pay attention to your red flag moments. We have them. That's that voice. That's that moment of saying something just doesn't feel right. Maybe it's that little voice in your head that you can't explain. Or maybe it's the voice of someone else in your life, your mom, a friend. Someone has that voice that speaks up. And you, when they do, you're annoyed, right? When someone says something that causes, I have all the information. I'm ready to make a choice. No, wait just a second. Are you sure? Are you sure she's the right one? Oh, don't do that to me right now. Are you sure you can afford that? Are you sure you should send that email or that text? I already am prepared. I knew what I wanted to do. You know how annoying that is, right? Guys, it doesn't mean the decision you're about to make is necessarily wrong. It just means maybe you should pause for a second, for a minute, a day. Pray about it. Sleep on it. Seek the advice of someone you trust. Seek out a little bit more information. I like what Jesus is talking to his disciples in John chapter 14. And this is what I think it all comes down to. This is a promise Jesus was making for those of us who've chosen to be children of God, to follow him. And look at what John 14, verses 15 through 18 says. It says, if you love me, Jesus says, keep my commands. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him or knows him. But you know him. For he lives with you and will be in you. He will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. Jesus said, I've given you my Spirit, the voice of God in your life. And sometimes that voice says, hold on. There's an upper story at play here, and you don't have all the information, even though you think you do. Just pause for a moment. What we call a conscience is the Holy Spirit of God, oftentimes, trying to get your attention, trying to keep you from turning to the left or to the right when the best decision is to follow his path. Now, the second thing I want to ask you or to show you when asking yourself is there a tension that deserves my attention is this. I want you to think about this. You can't predict the outcome. You can't. I can't either. We cannot always predict the outcome. One problem in our decision making is that when we have assembled all the facts, we think we can predict the outcome, don't we? We think we can predict what's going to happen. I know this, and this. Therefore, if I take this action, this will happen. And how often does it not work out that way? How many times have you thought that you were making the right decision only to have it all blow up in your face? It happens, and you know why? Because even when you think you have all the facts, you don't. Guys, that's the definition of disappointment. When things don't turn out the way you expected them to. Sometimes we make the best choice we can with the information we have. We simply have to risk the disappointment of things not turning out the way we expected. But there are other times when the voice of God, the Holy Spirit, nudges us and says, just pause for a moment, a day, a week, and see if there's something you've missed or a better way to write the story. I think God's saying, my upper story has a better story to tell than the one you think you want to tell right now. Just pause for a moment and see. Give it a chance. And the third thing, as we talk about, is there a tension that deserves your attention? I want you to ask yourself this question. Have you surrendered to God's upper story? Have you surrendered to God's upper story? Here's the hardest part about decision making for most, if not all of us. Surrendering our will, our desires to God's will and His desires for us. I know a lot of you in this room at some point have stood up and maybe in front of this church or another and said, I believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of the living God, and I want to make Him my Savior and my Lord. We're saying that we are surrendering our desires and our lives to His desires. That's why I think this series, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, is such a big deal. It's why I think we have to be willing to ask the conscience question. Is there a tension that deserves my attention right now? Is that voice that's nagging me to take a moment, to pause, to explore, and to consider before making a decision that might lead to disappointment? Is that worth listening to? That kind of regret that could have been avoided if I had just paused for a moment. Let me ask you this way. Do you trust that God can and will write a better story for your life than you can? Do you trust that? Do you believe that God is sovereign over everything? Do you believe that God's all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-wise? Do you believe that? And two, do you believe that He really cares about you enough to say, if you'll trust me, I will write a better story than you can for your life? Guys, you're part of a much bigger story. You're a part of His story. And it's possible that there are times when He is the voice that's calling on you to pause. The real question is, will you stop to listen? I want to give you two things based on the conscience question that you could do to help you avoid this kind of regret. Go ahead and show these two things. I want you to think about this. Ask yourself these two questions. Is one, or say, I will pause to understand the cause of my hesitation. That's the conscience question. When I have that something, it's not to say that you're already making the wrong decision. It's not to say we're just going to base all of our decisions on these feelings. It's just to say, when that voice speaks up, are you willing to pause to consider the cause of that voice, of that hesitation? And two, are you willing to say, I will explore rather than ignore my conscience? I will take the time to hear it out. I've given you, over the last few weeks, 3 questions to consider in decision making that, man, I got to tell you guys, I need to apply these 5 questions to my life more than any of you do in yours. When I'm looking at, that's why I was so drawn to doing this series with you. Is, man, take the time to ask yourself the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself? Take the time to ask yourself the legacy question. Is this really the story I want to write? And take time to ask the conscience question. Is there a tension here that deserves me to pause, that deserves my attention? We got 2 more questions. Next week, we're going to talk about the maturity question. I'll get into that later. But let's leave it right here for today. I'm wondering, as the worship team goes ahead and makes their way on up, I'm wondering if there's a decision you need to make today. One that's speaking in that little voice in the back of your head right now that says, it's time for you to make a decision to surrender. To surrender your will to God's will. To saying, I will stop. I want to make better decisions. I want to have fewer regrets in my life. I want to hear what the voice of God has to say. I'm ready to start listening to that. And I'm telling you, if you make that decision to surrender your life to Him, that's a decision you will never regret. And it's going to remove all kinds of other regret with it.